March 23, 1918, 7:18 in the morning. A thunderous explosion tears through the Quai de la Seine in northeast Paris. 15 people lie dead or dying. 36 more writhe in agony from shrapnel wounds. But the Parisians, staring at the smoking crater, cannot comprehend what just happened. There was no warning, no air raid siren, no drone of aircraft engines, no distant rumble of artillery. The shell simply fell from the sky like a meteor from space. Within minutes, another explosion rocks the city, then another. By nightfall, 21 shells have struck Paris and its suburbs. The mystery deepens with each detonation. Where are these shells coming from? The nearest German lines are over 60 miles away, far beyond the range of any artillery piece ever built. Some Parisians believe enemy agents have hidden a gun somewhere within the city itself. Others imagine a new type of Zeppelin, flying so high it cannot be seen or heard. French authorities search abandoned quarries and underground tunnels, convinced the weapon must be nearby. They are wrong. The shells are coming from a gun positioned 120 kilometers away, 75 miles distant, in a forest clearing behind German lines. It is a weapon that should not exist. A gun so massive, so revolutionary, so impossibly ambitious that its very existence defies the laws of artillery warfare as the world understands them in 1918. This is the story of the Paris gun, the Kaiser's wonder weapon, a technological marvel that could hurl shells into the stratosphere, a strategic blunder that killed hundreds but changed nothing, an engineering triumph that ended in total destruction, leaving behind only concrete ruins and unanswered questions. The story begins 2 years earlier, in the winter of 1916, when Germany faced a brutal reality. The war had become a grinding stalemate. Millions had died in the trenches for gains measured in meters. The Western Front stretched in an unbroken line of barbed wire and machine guns from the Swiss border to the English Channel. Neither side could break through. The German High Command needed something, anything, that could shake Allied resolve and prove that German technology still ruled the battlefield. Professor Fritz Rausenberger, the chief artillery constructor at Krupp Works in Essen, had an audacious proposal. He would build a gun capable of bombarding Paris from German-held territory. Not just any gun, but a weapon that could fire over distances no artillery piece had ever achieved. The current world record for artillery range stood at just 35 kilometers, achieved during the German bombardment of Dunkirk. Rausenberger proposed to triple that distance, more than triple it in fact, to reach 130 kilometers. The engineering challenges were staggering. To propel a shell that far required velocities approaching 1,600 meters per second, nearly 5 times the speed of sound. The barrel would need to be longer than anything ever constructed, yet strong enough to contain chamber pressures exceeding 69,000 pounds per square inch. At those pressures, temperatures inside the firing chamber would reach 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel itself. But Rausenberger had done his calculations. He knew that conventional artillery trajectories would never work. Shells fired at the standard 45-degree angle lost too much energy fighting air resistance in the dense lower atmosphere. His solution was radical. Fire the shells nearly straight up, at angles between 50 and 55 degrees. The projectiles would soar to altitudes of over 40 kilometers, well into the stratosphere, where the air is so thin it barely exists. Up there, in the near vacuum conditions at the edge of space, drag virtually disappears. The shells would spend 3 minutes in flight, most of that time coasting through the stratosphere before arcing back down onto Paris.
Field Marshal Paul von Hindenburg and General Erich Ludendorff approved the project. Krupp received orders to proceed with maximum urgency. Rausenberger's team began with worn-out 38-centimeter naval gun barrels salvaged from the Long Max railway artillery. These massive tubes were bored out and fitted with 21-centimeter rifled liners, then extended with smoothbore sections to create barrels measuring 34 to 37 meters in total length, roughly as tall as a 12-story building. The engineering was brilliant. To prevent the impossibly long barrel from sagging under its own weight, Rausenberger designed an external truss system that worked like a suspension bridge, with adjustable screw jacks maintaining perfect alignment. The entire weapon, mounted on a special railway carriage, weighed 256 tons. The shells themselves represented another triumph of metallurgy. Each 106-kilogram projectile had to withstand the crushing acceleration and heat of firing. The steel casing had to be so thick that only 7 kilograms remained for the actual explosive payload, barely 6% of the shell's weight. But that limitation was acceptable. This weapon was not designed to destroy Paris. It was designed to terrorize it. Perhaps the strangest requirement was the numbered shell system. The extreme firing stresses wore out the barrel so rapidly that the bore diameter expanded with each shot. Krupp manufactured shells in sequential sets of 60, each slightly larger than the last. Gun crews had to fire them in exact numerical order. Firing out of sequence could jam an oversized shell in the bore, causing a catastrophic detonation that would destroy the gun and kill the entire crew. By November 20, 1917, the first gun was ready for testing at the Altenwalde Range near Cuxhaven. The initial test firing succeeded. On January 30, 1918, a shell flew 125 kilometers, confirming that Rausenberger's calculations were correct. The impossible gun worked. Krupp produced 3 operational guns and 7 interchangeable barrels, though only 2 gun carriages were built. The weapons were transported by rail to carefully prepared positions in the forest of Coucy, north of Crépy-en-Laon, approximately 120 kilometers from Paris. German engineers had poured massive circular concrete emplacements, each one adding another 300 tons of infrastructure. The guns were positioned in a triangle formation on the wooded reverse slope of Mont de Joie, hidden from French aerial reconnaissance by the forest canopy. The crews were not Army artillerymen, but 80-man naval gun teams commanded by Vice Admiral Maximilian Raguet. The operation was so secret that most crewmen did not know the gun's actual target until the first shell was loaded. 30 conventional Army artillery batteries were positioned around the Paris guns, ordered to fire simultaneously with each shot to mask the distinctive report and confuse French sound-ranging equipment. 10 aircraft squadrons provided air cover. Everything was ready. The gun had a name now, officially designated as the Kaiser Wilhelm Geschütz. But it would enter history under a different name, one given to it by its victims, the Paris gun. On March 21, 1918, Germany launched Operation Michael, the Great Spring Offensive, designed to smash through Allied lines and win the war before American troops could arrive in force. 2 days later, at precisely 7:18 on the morning of March 23, the first Paris gun fired. The shell climbed into the stratosphere. 3 minutes later, it fell on Paris. The bombardment had begun. The first shells brought confusion. By the 3rd day, they brought terror. And on the 6th day, Good Friday, March 29, 1918, they brought unspeakable tragedy. Parisians had spent the week trying to understand their invisible attacker.
French reconnaissance pilot Didier Duras had already located the gun positions in the forest of Coucy by March 24, barely 24 hours after the first shell fell. Artillery spotters had traced the trajectories. Military authorities knew where the shells came from, but that knowledge did nothing to stop them. The Paris guns were positioned deep behind German lines, beyond the reach of French counter-battery fire. Random French artillery shells had begun falling near the emplacements, wounding half a dozen German crewmen, but the bombardment continued. Every 15 minutes, another shell. Sometimes the interval stretched to 20 minutes, sometimes shortened to 10, but the pattern was relentless. Parisians learned to live with the randomness. There were no air raid sirens, no warnings, no all-clear signals. An explosion might come in the next minute or not until tomorrow. The psychological pressure was constant and crushing. American Ambassador William Graves Sharp walked the streets of Paris during those days and recorded what he saw. His dispatches to Secretary of State Robert Lansing capture the surreal atmosphere. As though some strange visitation from the planet Mars, bringing death in its pathway, had suddenly intruded upon the streets of the city. The shells simply dropped from space like some huge meteorite. By March 27, thousands queued at railway stations, desperate to flee. The Gare Montparnasse suspended ticket sales entirely, overwhelmed by the crowds. Stores closed their doors. The metro stopped running. People stood in the streets staring upward, searching the empty sky for aircraft that never appeared. But many Parisians refused to run. Marie Harrison, a reporter writing on April 25, described their resilience. On Good Friday, it began early in the morning, and the explosions continued throughout the day, occurring precisely at every quarter of an hour. That is a form of irritation which the Huns thought would empty Paris in a week. The greater number of Parisians went quietly about their work and did not even leave the business at hand to seek shelter. Good Friday arrived with spring sunshine. The liturgical calendar marked this day as sacred, the commemoration of Christ's crucifixion. Churches across Paris held special services. The Church of Saint-Gervais-Saint-Protais, a magnificent structure in the 4th arrondissement near the Hôtel de Ville, scheduled a special concert of sacred music. The church dated to the 7th century, though the current building had been rebuilt in the Gothic and Renaissance styles. Its soaring, vaulted ceiling and stone columns created perfect acoustics for the choir. By 4:30 in the afternoon, the church was packed. Approximately 300 worshippers filled the pews. Many were women and children. The choir performed sacred motets, their voices echoing off the ancient stones. Outside, the spring afternoon was peaceful. 6 days of bombardment had killed 37 people and wounded 91. Terrible, yes, but Paris had endured worse. The city was holding. At Stellung 23, the German gun position in the forest of Coucy, the naval crew prepared shell number 48. They threaded the rifled projectile into the bore with methodical precision, secured the breech, and loaded the propellant charge. Vice Admiral Rogge gave the firing order. The gun elevated to 52 degrees. At approximately 4:25 p.m., it fired. The shell climbed through the troposphere, through the stratosphere, reaching an apex of 42.3 kilometers. The Earth rotated beneath it during its 3-minute flight. Then gravity pulled it down, accelerating through the thinning air, screaming back toward the city below. It struck one of the stone pillars supporting the high vaulted roof of Saint Gervais Church. The massive stone pillar shattered. Tons of masonry, the roof's supporting structure, sections of the vault itself, carved stone decorations, everything collapsed directly onto the congregation below. People had no time to scream. The ancient stones simply fell on them, crushing them where they sat. The casualties were catastrophic. 88 people died instantly or in the hours that followed, with some accounts placing the number as high as 91. Another 68 suffered serious injuries. More than one-third of the entire bombardment's eventual death toll came from this single shell. Among the dead was Henri Strolin, counselor of the Swiss legation, and his wife. Baronne Violette de Coubertin, sister-in-law of Pierre de Coubertin, who founded the modern Olympics, was crushed beneath the stones. Elizabeth Basten, the 16-year-old daughter of the Belgian consul general, died beside her family. Mothers, children, elderly grandparents, all buried together under rubble that minutes earlier had been one of Paris's most beautiful churches. Ambassador Sharp visited the scene within hours. His report to Washington conveys the horror. The appalling destruction wrought by this shell is probably not equaled by any single discharge of any hostile gun in the cruelty and horrors of its results. Nearly 100 mangled corpses lying in the morgues, with almost as many seriously wounded, attested to the measure of the toll exacted. The response in the French Parliament was immediate and furious. A socialist leader rose to speak, his voice shaking with rage. At the moment when women, children, and the aged were imploring heaven to end this horrible butchery, the roof of the church, shattered by steel, responded with blood to their prayers. Germany had miscalculated catastrophically. The Saint-Gervais massacre did not break Parisian morale. It transformed fear into rage. Ambassador Sharp observed the change. The indignation of the people of Paris only served to strengthen their resolve to resist, to the last man if necessary. The bombardment continued. Shells fell on April 1st, April 3rd, April 8th. Each day brought more craters, more casualties, more grief. But each day also brought more determination. Parisians learned to avoid large gatherings during shelling periods. They learned which areas seemed to be hit most frequently and which appeared safer. Daily life resumed despite the explosions. Cafes reopened, the metro ran again, people returned to work. The randomness remained the worst part. An artillery barrage at least has a rhythm, a beginning and an end. The Paris gun offered no such mercy. A shell might arrive while you were buying bread, or walking your children to school, or sitting in church on a Friday afternoon. There was no pattern, no way to stay safe, except pure luck. By May 1st, when the first phase of the bombardment ended, the Paris gun had fired approximately 183 shells that landed within the city limits. Another 137 had fallen short or overshot their target entirely. A stark reminder of the weapon's inherent inaccuracy. The range probable error was 2.4 kilometers, with lateral dispersion of 0.8 kilometers. Only targets the size of entire cities could be hit with any consistency. The death toll stood at 121 killed and 250 wounded. The Saint-Gervais tragedy alone accounted for 75% of the fatalities. The numbers were terrible, but they were not catastrophic. Paris had endured the siege of 1870-71, had survived air raids and Zeppelin attacks earlier in this war. The city would survive this too. In the forest of Coucy, the German gun crews went through the laborious process of barrel replacement. After 60 rounds, the bore had expanded so much that the gun was losing range. The barrel had to be returned to Krupp for reboring, expanding the caliber from 210 mm to 224 mm, then eventually to 238 mm. Each rebored barrel received a new set of matched shells, manufactured to the new dimensions. Each reboring also reduced the gun's maximum range, eventually requiring the entire weapon to be moved forward to new positions closer to Paris. The bombardment would resume on May 27th, timed to coincide with the next German offensive. But the strategic goal, breaking French civilian morale, had already failed. The Paris gun had proven itself a technological marvel and a strategic disaster.
The people of Paris had looked death in the eye and refused to blink. The Paris gun represented a fundamental shift in the science of ballistics. Every artillery piece ever built before it operated within the dense lower atmosphere. The Paris gun sent its projectiles into space itself, or as close to space as any human-made object had reached in 1918. To understand the weapon's revolutionary nature requires understanding what happened during those 3 minutes of flight. The shell left the muzzle at 1,640 meters per second, Mach 4.8, nearly 5 times the speed of sound. At that velocity, air friction generated such heat that the shell's surface glowed red. The shock wave trailing behind it was powerful enough to shatter windows if the gun were fired near inhabited areas, which is why the emplacements were built in remote forests. The shell climbed steeply, angled at 50 to 55 degrees from horizontal. In the first 30 seconds, it passed through the troposphere, the weather layer where humans live, where clouds form, where aircraft of 1918 could fly. By 1 minute into flight, it had punched through the stratosphere, reaching altitudes where the air pressure was 1/100th of sea level values. At its apex, 42.3 kilometers above the Earth, the shell entered the stratopause, the boundary between the stratosphere and mesosphere. No human-made object had ever flown so high. The altitude record would stand until October 3, 1942, when the first German V-2 rocket reached 100 kilometers, the official boundary of space. For 24 years, the Paris gun shells held the altitude record for human technology. Up in the stratosphere, the physics changed completely. With virtually no air resistance, the shell coasted like a spacecraft. This was why the gun could achieve such impossible ranges. The projectiles spent most of their flight in conditions approaching a vacuum. When Rausenberger did his calculations, he had to account for factors no artillery designer had ever considered before. The most remarkable was the Coriolis effect, the apparent deflection caused by Earth's rotation. During the 3-minute flight, the Earth rotated beneath the shell. Paris moved eastward by several hundred meters while the projectile was in the air. To compensate, German gun crews had to aim slightly to the left, allowing for the rightward drift caused by planetary rotation. This was ballistics at the edge of aerospace engineering. But accuracy suffered accordingly. The range probable error of 2.4 kilometers meant that half of all shells landed more than 1.5 miles from the aim point. Lateral dispersion added another 800 meters of uncertainty. German gunners were essentially firing at a target the size of a city and hoping to hit somewhere within it. Precision was impossible. This was area bombardment in its purest form, terror from above, random and unavoidable. The 3-minute flight time created another psychological weapon. French sound-ranging equipment could detect the distant boom of the gun firing, but by the time the sound arrived, the shell was already halfway through its trajectory. There was no time to issue warnings, no time to take cover. The first indication that a shell was coming was the explosion when it struck. Parisians described the sounds of impact in their letters and diaries. There was the whistle, brief, high-pitched, growing louder for perhaps 2 seconds before impact. Then the explosion itself, not as large as aerial bombs, but distinctive, sharp, and powerful. Then silence, followed by screams, followed by sirens as emergency services rushed to the crater. And then the waiting. 15 minutes, maybe 20, before the next shell. Or maybe not for hours. Or maybe in the next 5 minutes. The randomness was maddening. The crater profiles told the story of the shell's ballistic properties. Each impact created a hole roughly 10 feet across and 4 feet deep, substantial but not devastating. The 7-kilogram explosive payload was simply too small to cause massive destruction. A single Paris gun shell carried less explosive than one British 250-pound aerial bomb. But the aerial bombs came in raids that ended. The Paris gun never stopped. French authorities tried everything to minimize casualties. They published guidelines for where to seek shelter during bombardment periods. They identified the areas of the city that seemed to be hit most frequently and evacuated vulnerable populations. They stationed observers at high points across Paris, equipped with telephones to report incoming shells. None of it made much difference. The shells arrived too fast, too randomly, and from too high up to allow effective countermeasures. The most effective French response was counter-battery fire, and even that had limited success. By May 1918, French artillery had fired over 3,000 shells at the suspected gun positions in the forest of Coucy. Some of these rounds landed close enough to wound German crewmen and damage support equipment. But the guns themselves, protected by their massive concrete emplacements and hidden under forest canopy, remained operational. French heavy artillery also engaged the positions directly. Rail-mounted 34-centimeter guns, themselves enormous weapons, were brought forward to fire at extreme range into the forest area. Aerial bombardment missions were flown. Intelligence officers interrogated captured German prisoners, hoping to learn operational details. Slowly, painfully, the French gathered information about their tormentor. They learned that the gun crews were naval personnel, specialists trained in the precision required for long-range naval gunnery. They learned about the numbered shell system and the rapid barrel wear. They learned that the guns had to be moved periodically as the barrels wore out and lost range. French reconnaissance aircraft tracked the guns' movements from Mont-de-Joie to Beaumont-en-Benne to Bruyères-sur-Fer, each position slightly closer to Paris than the last. But knowing where the guns were and being able to destroy them proved to be different problems. The emplacements were 40 kilometers behind the German front lines, protected by minefields, machine gun nests, and infantry battalions. A ground assault was impossible. Artillery and air attacks were ineffective against hardened concrete positions hidden under dense forest. The French could only wait and endure. The gun crews themselves faced their own dangers. On March 25, barely 3 days into the bombardment, a crew error on gun number 3 caused a catastrophic barrel failure. A shell was loaded out of sequence, too large for the current bore diameter. When the gun fired, the shell jammed partway down the barrel and detonated. The explosion destroyed the barrel, wrecked the breech mechanism, and killed or wounded 17 German personnel. It was the first major accident, but not the last. The barrel replacement process was dangerous and exhausting. The warm barrel had to be carefully removed from the gun mount, loaded onto a special rail car, and transported back to the Krupp factory in Essen, a journey of over 400 kilometers through war-torn countryside. At the factory, workers rebored the tube to the next larger caliber, a precision machining operation that took several days. Then the rebuilt barrel made the return journey to the front. The whole process took 2 to 3 weeks, during which that gun was out of action. The Germans built spare barrels to maintain operational tempo. 7 interchangeable barrels were manufactured for the 3 guns, allowing continuous operations while barrels were being rebored. But each reboring reduced the barrel's maximum range. A fresh 210mm barrel could reach 130 kilometers. A rebored 224mm barrel could manage only 120 kilometers. A twice-rebored 238mm barrel might reach only 100 kilometers before it had to be scrapped entirely. This progressive loss of range forced the guns to move forward. The original positions at Montjoie were abandoned in May. New emplacements at Beaumont-en-Bayonne brought the guns to within 110 kilometers of Paris. When those positions came under French artillery fire, the guns moved again to Bruyères-sur-Fer, just 91 kilometers from their target. Each move was a massive undertaking. The 256-ton gun and carriage had to be disassembled, transported by rail, and reassembled at the new position, where engineers had already prepared concrete emplacements. Camouflage had to be erected. Supporting artillery batteries had to be repositioned. Air cover had to be coordinated. The complexity of the operation was staggering. Yet the bombardment continued. May 27 to June 11, July 15 to 16, August 5 to 9. 4 distinct bombardment periods, timed to coincide with German offensives. Each time, the same sequence. Shells falling from the sky without warning, craters appearing in streets and parks, casualties mounting, Parisians enduring. The final count would be 320 to 367 shells fired, depending on which records are consulted. Of these, only 183 actually landed within Paris city limits, roughly half. The rest fell short, overshot, or landed in suburbs and countryside. This 50% hit rate against a target the size of a city demonstrated the fundamental limitation of extreme-range artillery. You could hit somewhere near your target, but precision was impossible. 256 people killed, 620 wounded. The Saint Gervais Church alone accounted for 91 dead. The rest died singly or in small groups as shells struck homes, streets, parks, and businesses across the capital. The Paris gun was a weapon designed to terrorize a city. But the city refused to be terrorized, and that refusal sealed the weapon's fate as a strategic failure.
Vice Admiral Maximilien Roget commanded a crew that lived in a world of precise numbers and constant danger. The 80 men of the naval gun battery were specialists in a new kind of warfare, ballistics at the edge of space itself. Every shot required calculations that had never been done before in the history of artillery. The morning routine began with measurements. After each firing, the barrel bore expanded slightly. Specialists inserted precision gauges to measure the new diameter to within hundredths of a millimeter. These measurements determined which shell would be loaded next. The numbered sequence was absolute. Load shell 37 when the bore was sized for shell 36, and the projectile would jam in the tube. The resulting detonation would kill everyone within 50 meters. Temperature affected everything. Cold mornings meant the steel barrel contract slightly, changing the bore dimensions. Hot afternoons caused expansion. Air temperature, air pressure, humidity, all of these factors influenced the propellant charge calculations. The crews maintained detailed logbooks recording every measurement, every environmental condition, every shell fired. The loading process took approximately 15 minutes. First, the barrel had to be swabbed clean of residue from the previous shot. The buildup of carbon and metal particles could affect the next shell's trajectory. Then the new shell was brought forward on a special loading carriage. The projectile weighed 106 kilograms, too heavy for manual handling. Crews used a mechanical hoist to lift it to the breech. The critical moment came next. The shell had pre-cut rifling grooves on raised bands around its circumference. These grooves had to align perfectly with the rifling in the barrel. Crews literally screwed the shell into the bore, rotating it slowly until the rifling engaged. Any cross-threading could damage the barrel or cause a misfire. The process required patience and perfect precision. With the shell seated, the breech was closed and locked. The propellant charge came next.
Not a single bag, but multiple charges calculated based on the bore measurements and environmental conditions. Too little propellant and the shell would fall short. Too much and the barrel could rupture. The calculations were complex, accounting for the expansion of gases at extreme temperatures, the resistance of the rifling, the weight of the specific shell being fired. The gun was elevated to its firing angle, typically 50 to 55 degrees, but varying based on range requirements and wind conditions. At these steep angles, the massive barrel pointed almost straight up, supported by the external truss system that prevented sagging. Traversing the gun to aim left or right required rotating the entire 256-ton weapon on its circular concrete mount, a process managed by screw jacks and mechanical advantage, but still requiring significant time and effort. When everything was ready, Rajay gave the firing order. One man pulled the lanyard. The primer ignited. In a fraction of a second, the propellant charge exploded, generating chamber pressures of 69,600 pounds per square inch and temperatures exceeding 3,600 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew accelerated down the 37-meter barrel, spinning faster and faster as the rifling engaged, until it emerged from the muzzle at 1,640 meters per second. The recoil was tremendous. Despite hydraulic dampeners and the gun's massive weight, the entire weapon lurched backward. The shock wave from the muzzle blast was powerful enough to knock down men standing too close. This is why 30 conventional artillery batteries surrounded the gun positions. Their simultaneous firing helped mask the Paris gun's distinctive report, but they also needed to be far enough away to avoid the muzzle blast.
Then the waiting. 3 minutes until impact. During that time, the crews prepared for the next shot. Swab the barrel. Check the bore measurements. Calculate the propellant charge for the next shell. Bring forward shell number 38, or 42, or 56, whichever came next in the sequence. The rhythm was methodical, almost mechanical. Fire, measure, calculate, load, fire again. But the waiting also brought anxiety. French counter-battery fire had started almost immediately. By March 24, random French shells were falling in the forest around the gun positions. The concrete emplacements protected the guns themselves, but the crews were vulnerable. Support personnel, ammunition handlers, mechanics, security troops worked in the open. When French shells arrived, men dove for whatever cover they could find. The French fire was largely ineffective, but it was terrifying nonetheless. The shells came without warning, just like the Paris gun's own projectiles terrorized Paris. A French 240mm shell would arrive with a shriek and explode in the forest, sending shrapnel slicing through trees. Men were wounded, equipment was damaged. The psychological pressure mounted. The accident on March 25 demonstrated how dangerous the operation was even without enemy fire. Gun number 3 experienced a crew error. Accounts differ on exactly what happened, but the result was catastrophic. Either a shell was loaded out of numerical sequence, or there was a miscalculation in the bore measurements, or the shell itself had a manufacturing defect. Whatever the cause, when the gun fired, the shell jammed in the barrel and detonated. The explosion was devastating. The barrel split open like a peeled banana. The breech mechanism was destroyed. Shrapnel killed several men instantly and wounded more than a dozen others. The gun mount was damaged but repairable. But gun number 3 was out of action for weeks while a replacement barrel was brought from Krupp. The investigation that followed led to even stricter procedures. Double-checking of measurements became mandatory. 2 officers had to verify shell numbers before loading. The logbooks became even more detailed. But the incident reminded everyone that they were operating at the absolute edge of what was mechanically possible. One mistake, one miscalculation, one moment of inattention could be fatal. The crews also faced exhaustion. Operating the Paris gun was physically demanding work. Loading the shells, traversing the gun, maintaining the equipment, all of it required muscle power and stamina. The men worked in shifts, but during bombardment periods, everyone was on duty almost continuously. Sleep came in short intervals between firings. Food was basic military rations, though the naval crews at least received better provisions than Army personnel. Water had to be trucked in, as did all supplies. The gun positions were deliberately remote, which meant logistics were complicated. Every shell, every propellant charge, every spare part had to travel by rail from Germany through war-torn countryside to the forest emplacements. Security was constant. The Germans knew French intelligence was desperately trying to locate and destroy the guns. Patrols covered the forest perimeter. Sentries challenged anyone approaching. Aircraft provided air cover during daylight hours. At night, the positions went dark. No lights that could give away locations to enemy aircraft. The camouflage was elaborate. Netting covered the gun positions, with branches and foliage woven through to match the surrounding forest. When reconnaissance aircraft approached, smoke pots created artificial fog to obscure visibility. Dummy positions were constructed elsewhere to draw enemy fire away from the actual emplacements. The deception required constant maintenance as seasons changed and foliage patterns shifted.
Despite all precautions, French intelligence pieced together information. Reconnaissance pilot Didier Dorat had located the general area on March 24. Subsequent flights narrowed the positions. By April, French artillery was ranging in on the coordinates. By May, the guns had to move to avoid destruction. The relocation process was exhausting. Disassembling a 256-ton gun and carriage in a combat zone, moving it by rail to a new position, and reassembling it required weeks of work. During that time, the bombardment of Paris ceased. The Germans could not afford to leave the guns vulnerable during transit, so movements happened only during lulls in their offensive operations. Each new position required freshly prepared emplacements. Engineers had to pour concrete foundations, install the circular turntable mechanism, build protective barriers, and erect camouflage, all while under potential French artillery fire. The new positions at Beaumont-en-Bain and later at Bruyères-sur-Fer were constructed under tremendous time pressure. The gun crews watched as their barrels wore out. After 60 rounds, the rifling was so eroded that accuracy degraded noticeably. Range decreased as the bore expanded. The barrel had to go back to Krupp for reboring. Each gun had spare barrels to maintain operational tempo, but the logistics were complex. A barrel being rebored meant one less available for firing. The 7 barrels for 3 guns meant constant rotation. One firing, one in transit to Krupp, one being rebored, one in transit back, one being installed, one in reserve. As summer progressed and the German offensive stalled, the crews must have known their mission was failing. Paris continued to function. There was no mass exodus, no collapse of morale, no political pressure on the French government to seek peace. The shells kept falling, the craters kept appearing, people kept dying. But the city endured. The final bombardment period came in early August 1918. By then, Allied counteroffensives had begun. The front was moving, not in Germany's favor. The gun positions, already relocated twice, faced potential capture. On August 9, the last Paris gun shell fell on the city. The bombardment that had begun on March 23 was over. The crews received orders to withdraw. They disassembled the guns, loaded them onto rail cars, and transported them back into Germany. And then they destroyed them. Every gun, every barrel, every piece of equipment was systematically demolished. The Germans would not let this technology fall into Allied hands. Vice Admiral Raga and his 80 men had operated one of the most sophisticated weapons ever built. They had fired projectiles into the stratosphere with precision that required accounting for Earth's rotation. They had maintained operational tempo under enemy fire and constant pressure. They had done everything asked of them. And it had changed nothing.
August 9, 1918. The last Paris gun shell falls on the city. 139 days after the first explosion on the Quai de la Seine, the bombardment ends. The final count? 320 to 367 shells fired. 183 impacts within Paris city limits. 256 killed. 620 wounded. Property damage substantial but not crippling. And absolutely zero strategic effect. The Paris gun failed at every level except the technical. As an engineering achievement, it was magnificent. As a weapon of war, it was useless. As a tool of psychological warfare, it backfired spectacularly. The weapon designed to terrorize Paris into surrender instead unified the city in defiant resistance. The German High Command had fundamentally misunderstood the nature of civilian morale in modern war. They believed that random terror from an unstoppable weapon would shatter French resolve. They thought Parisians would flee the city in panic, creating a refugee crisis that would destabilize the French government and force peace negotiations. They imagined newspaper headlines screaming about civilian casualties, political pressure mounting on Premier Georges Clemenceau to seek terms. None of it happened. The initial panic of the first few days evaporated as Parisians adapted. People learned to live with the bombardment the same way they had learned to live with air raids, with rationing, with the daily casualty lists from the front. The random nature of the shelling meant nowhere was completely safe, but it also meant that the odds of being hit were actually quite low. Life went on. The Saint-Gervais tragedy, which the Germans must have believed would break Parisian morale, instead hardened it. The image of women and children crushed in a church on Good Friday was so shocking, so viscerally offensive, that it galvanized rather than terrorized. Ambassador Sharp was correct when he observed that the indignation only strengthened resolve to resist. The military effect was negligible. The Paris gun was not designed to hit military targets, and with its 2.4-kilometer range probable error, it could not have hit them even if trying. Of the 183 shells that landed in Paris, not one struck a militarily significant target. No headquarters were destroyed. No ammunition depots exploded. No troop concentrations were dispersed. The weapon killed civilians and destroyed civilian property. Nothing more. The propaganda value Germany hoped to gain also evaporated. Initially, German newspapers celebrated the mysterious weapon that was terrorizing the enemy capital. But as the weeks passed and Paris continued to function, the story lost its appeal. The German public, facing starvation due to the Allied blockade and reading daily casualty lists from the failing spring offensive, had more immediate concerns than whether shells were falling on Paris. Allied propaganda, by contrast, exploited the bombardment effectively. The image of Germany using a superweapon to kill civilians helped counter German claims that the Allied blockade was cruel and unjust. British and American newspapers published accounts of the Saint-Gervais massacre, complete with photographs of the destroyed church and lists of the victims. The Paris gun became evidence of German barbarism, not German technological superiority. The cost-benefit analysis was damning. Krupp's best engineers spent months designing the weapon. The factory diverted resources from other artillery production to build 3 guns and 7 barrels. The steel used in one Paris gun barrel could have built multiple conventional field guns. The shells required precision manufacturing that consumed skilled labor. The 80-man naval crews were specialists who could have served on U-boats or surface ships. The 30 supporting artillery batteries could have been used at the front. The 10 aircraft squadrons providing air cover were desperately needed elsewhere. All of this for 256 dead civilians in a city of 3 million and 0 military impact. Rear Admiral William Langenberg, writing after the war, summarized the failure. They failed in their principal mission because of the indomitable spirit of the Parisians, who realized the Germans' objective yet refused to be daunted. The weapon worked perfectly. The strategy was fundamentally flawed. The German spring offensive, which the Paris gun bombardment was supposed to support, also failed. Operation Michael began on March 21 with tremendous initial success. German stormtroopers broke through British lines, advancing 40 miles in the first week, the largest territorial gains by either side since 1914. For a moment, victory seemed possible. But the advance stalled. Allied lines bent but did not break. American troops arrived in increasing numbers. By April, the offensive had failed to achieve its objectives. Germany tried again in April with Operation Georgette, in May with Operation Blücher-York, in June with Operation Gneisenau. Each offensive gained ground but failed to break through. Each one cost casualties Germany could not replace. By July, the initiative had shifted. On July 18th, French and American forces counterattacked at the Second Battle of the Marne. The tide had turned. Germany was now defending, no longer advancing. And the Paris gun, positioned in forests that were suddenly vulnerable to Allied advance, had to withdraw or risk capture. The decision to destroy the guns rather than let them fall into Allied hands made sense from a security perspective, but it also guaranteed that the weapon would have no historical impact. Without captured examples to study, Allied armies learned nothing from German long-range artillery technology. Without physical evidence, the full technical specifications remained German secrets for decades. Future artillery development proceeded along different lines entirely. The Treaty of Versailles, signed on June 28, 1919, included a specific provision requiring Germany to surrender one complete Paris gun to the Allies. Germany never complied. The guns were gone, destroyed in the summer of 1918. Krupp had incinerated the construction plans and research records. Professor Fritz Rausenberger, the chief designer, kept private notes that would not be published until decades after his death in 1926. The Paris gun became a ghost weapon, famous, feared, but physically erased from history. Only the concrete emplacements remained. American troops captured one spare mounting near Château Thierry after the war, but no operational weapon. French authorities surveyed the abandoned gun positions in the forest of Coucy, photographing the massive circular concrete foundations and the truss support structures. These ruins, still visible today, are the only physical evidence that the Paris gun ever existed. The American military conducted a comprehensive post-war evaluation of artillery technology. The Westervelt Board, named after its chairman General William Welt, examined every major artillery innovation of the war. Their conclusion on the Paris gun was blunt. Such guns have no military value, and their construction is not justifiable. The United States military had no interest in building similar weapons.
Neither did Britain or France or any other nation. The Paris gun represented a technological dead end. Extreme-range artillery required impossibly large weapons, impossibly expensive shells, and impossibly complex operations for impossibly limited results. The future of long-range bombardment lay in aircraft and eventually missiles, not in guns that fired shells into the stratosphere. Major General David Zabecki, writing in the modern era with access to all the historical records, concluded, "Though the Paris guns were an awesome technological achievement, they had no impact on the outcome of World War I. It is the definitive verdict on one of history's most ambitious military projects." The human toll, 256 dead, 620 wounded, was real and terrible for the families involved. But in the context of a war that killed 17 million people, the Paris guns' casualties barely registered as a footnote. The Somme offensive of 1916 produced over 1 million casualties. Verdun killed 300,000. The Spanish flu pandemic that struck in 1918 killed 50 million worldwide. Against this backdrop of industrial-scale death, the Paris gun was almost irrelevant. Yet it remains famous, remembered when other more successful weapons are forgotten. The reason is paradox. The Paris gun was the most advanced artillery piece ever built and one of the most useless. It could hit targets farther away than anything else in history, but could not hit anything specific. It was Germany's secret superweapon, and it accomplished nothing. It was a technological triumph and a strategic catastrophe. And perhaps that is why it fascinates us still. The Paris gun represents the moment when human technology reached so far that it exceeded human purpose. The engineers could build it, so they did, without fully considering whether they should or what it would actually accomplish. It is the military equivalent of building a ladder to the moon. Impressive, certainly. Useful? Not so much. The German crews who operated the guns through 4 months of bombardment performed their duties with professional competence. They maintained precision under pressure, operated complex machinery in combat conditions, and achieved what their superiors demanded of them. That their mission was fundamentally flawed was not their fault. They were sailors firing artillery into the stratosphere because generals wanted to terrorize a city. They did their job. The city refused to be terrorized. On August 9, 1918, when the last shell fell, the Paris guns' war ended. The weapon was withdrawn, dismantled, destroyed. Paris continued. The city that had endured siege in 1870, revolution in 1789, plague in the Middle Ages, survived one more assault. The monuments stood. The churches, Saint Gervais rebuilt among them, continued their liturgies. The Seine still flowed. The cafes reopened. Life went on. Germany fought on for 3 more months before the November armistice. The war ended not because of superweapons, but because of exhausted economies, depleted manpower, failed offensives, and American intervention. The Paris gun changed none of that. It killed civilians and wasted resources, nothing more. History remembers it anyway, not as a decisive weapon, but as a cautionary tale about the limits of technology, the resilience of cities, and the danger of mistaking engineering brilliance for strategic wisdom.
November 11, 1918. The armistice silences the guns across the Western Front. After 4 years, the war is over. Germany has been defeated. The Kaiser abdicates. The empire collapses. And in the forests of France, the concrete emplacements of the Paris gun positions stand empty and silent. Allied troops move forward through liberated territory, documenting abandoned German positions. Engineers survey the gun emplacements with amazement. The circular concrete platforms are intact, designed to support 256-ton weapons. The external truss systems remain, suspension bridge structures built to support barrels longer than most buildings are tall. Rail lines run through the forest, showing where the guns were transported. But the guns themselves are gone. American forces find one spare mounting assembly near Chateau Thierry, evidence that more guns were planned or partially built. They photograph it, measure it, study it. But without the actual barrel and breech mechanism, the mounting reveals little about the weapon's revolutionary design. The critical technology, the barrel construction, the rifling patterns, the shell design, the ballistic calculations, all of that disappeared when the Germans destroyed their guns in August. Krupp factory workers had followed orders. Every Paris gun barrel was cut into scrap. Every breech mechanism was smashed beyond recognition. The specialized shell manufacturing equipment was dismantled. Construction plans were burned. Research notes were destroyed. Professor Fritz Rausenberger, the genius behind the design, kept private notes but published nothing. When he died in 1926, his family preserved his papers, but they would not be analyzed and published until the 1980s. This deliberate erasure meant the Paris gun left almost no direct technical legacy. Artillery designers in the 1920s and 30s had to work from fragmentary information, rumors, and speculation. The Treaty of Versailles demanded Germany surrender a complete Paris gun, but the demand could not be met. The weapons no longer existed. The indirect legacy, however, was significant. The Paris gun proved that extreme long-range bombardment was technically possible. This knowledge influenced military thinking between the wars. Germany, forbidden by Versailles from building long-range artillery, turned to other technologies. The V-weapons program, V-1 flying bombs and V-2 ballistic missiles emerged directly from the strategic goal of bombarding enemy cities from long distances. If artillery was forbidden, rockets would suffice. The V-2 rocket, first successfully launched in October 1942, was explicitly designed to deliver warheads at twice the Paris gun's range. The ballistic trajectory was similar: climb to extreme altitude, coast through the stratosphere, fall on the target. But rockets eliminated the barrel wear problem, the need for massive fixed emplacements, the complex logistics of gun maintenance. The V-2 was mobile, reusable, and much more accurate than the Paris gun ever was. On October 3, 1942, a V-2 rocket reached an altitude of 100 kilometers, officially entering space and breaking the altitude record the Paris gun shells had held for 24 years. Technology had progressed from artillery shells entering the stratosphere to rockets entering space itself. The lineage was clear. German artillery engineer Fritz Rausenberger had also envisioned more ambitious projects. His private notes, eventually published in Gerald Bohl and Charles Murphy's 1988 book, Paris Kanonen, revealed plans for even larger weapons. A 30.5-centimeter gun firing 300-kilogram shells to 170 kilometers. A weapon to bombard London from Calais. None of these projects advanced beyond the design stage, but they showed that Rausenberger understood the implications of his work.
The Nazi V-3 cannon project of 1943-1944 attempted to revisit extreme-range artillery. The Hoch-Druckpumper, high-pressure pump, was a multi-chamber gun designed to bombard London from France. Multiple propellant charges along the barrel would accelerate shells to extreme velocities. The weapon was built into a hillside at Mimoyex in northern France, but Allied bombing destroyed it before it became operational. The project demonstrated that the dream of super long-range artillery had not died with the Paris gun. The Paris gun also influenced artillery doctrine in unexpected ways. The weapon proved that extreme range came at the cost of accuracy, payload, and barrel life. These were not temporary problems that better engineering could solve. They were fundamental physics limitations. Artillery designers in the 1920s and 1930s therefore focused on what artillery could do effectively: mobile guns with moderate ranges, able to deliver sustained fire with acceptable accuracy. The American military embraced this philosophy. The Westervelt Board's recommendation against super long-range guns shaped U.S. artillery development for decades. American designers focused on building robust, mobile field guns that could support infantry advances. The famous 75mm field gun, the 105mm howitzer, and the 155mm gun all emphasized mobility, reliability, and sustained fire rates over extreme range. British artillery followed similar principles. The 25-pounder gun howitzer became the standard field piece of World War II, prized for its versatility and reliability rather than extreme range. The lesson learned was clear. Artillery wins battles by supporting ground troops with accurate, sustained fire, not by lobbing shells at distant cities. French artillery development was complicated by the trauma of World War I. France had suffered more than any other Western nation. A generation of young men killed, entire regions devastated, cities damaged. The memory of German bombardment, both the Paris gun and conventional artillery, influenced French fortification strategy. The Maginot Line, built in the 1930s, was designed partly to protect against future long-range bombardment. Massive concrete fortifications would shelter troops and civilians from artillery fire. The strategy failed catastrophically when Germany invaded through Belgium in 1940, but the intent was clear. The Paris gun also left a cultural legacy. Roman Roland's 1920 novel Pierre et Luce tells the story of young lovers killed in the Saint-Gervais church tragedy. The book brought the human cost of the bombardment into sharp focus, personalizing casualties that otherwise appeared only as statistics in newspaper reports. Roland, already a Nobel laureate, used his literary prestige to condemn the weapon as an atrocity. Charlie Chaplin satirized the Paris gun in his 1940 film The Great Dictator. The fictional dictator Heinkel orders his forces to bombard Notre Dame Cathedral, but the supergun's shells only manage to destroy a tiny outhouse in the distance. The satire perfectly captured the weapon's essential futility: tremendous effort for negligible results. Chaplin's mockery helped cement the Paris gun's reputation as a symbol of technological hubris. In military museums, the Paris gun exists only in photographs and diagrams. No complete weapon survived. No shells remain. The most substantial physical evidence is the concrete emplacements in the forest of Coucy, still visible 80 years later. French authorities preserve the sites as historical monuments. Visitors can walk among the ruins, seeing the massive circular platforms that once supported the world's longest-range guns.
The Church of Saint-Gervais-Saint-Protais stands rebuilt. The roof that collapsed on Good Friday 1918 has been restored. Modern stained glass by artists Sylvie Gaudin and Claude Courageux honors the 91 victims. A memorial plaque lists their names. The church serves as headquarters for the monastic fraternities of Jerusalem, a contemplative community. It is a place of prayer now, not a tomb. The confusion between the Paris gun and Big Bertha persists to this day. Parisians in 1918 called their tormentor Big Bertha because that name was already famous from the siege of Liège in 1914. The actual Big Bertha, Dicke Bertha, was a 420mm siege howitzer with a range of only 9.3 kilometers. It demolished Belgian and French fortifications with tremendous explosive shells, the complete opposite of the Paris gun's approach. Big Berthas were captured by Allied forces and studied extensively. The Paris gun remained mysterious, hidden, and ultimately destroyed. Yet the names became interchangeable in popular memory. Modern historians have worked to disentangle the truth from legend. German artillery records, partially declassified in the 1970s and 1980s, provided new details. Rausenberger's private notes, published in 1988, revealed the design specifications. Ballistic computer models allowed modern engineers to verify the performance claims. The consensus is clear. The Paris gun performed exactly as designed.
It could hit Paris from 75 miles away. It sent shells into the stratosphere. It was a technological triumph. And it failed completely to achieve its military purpose. The final irony is that the Paris gun's greatest achievement was not military, but scientific. For 24 years, from 1918 to 1942, the Paris gun shells held the altitude record for human-made objects. They were the first artifacts of human engineering to enter the stratosphere. In that sense, the Paris gun was not just an artillery piece, but the ancestor of spaceflight. The engineers who calculated trajectories accounting for Earth's rotation were doing aerospace engineering before the term existed. When German engineers designed the V-2 rocket in the 1940s, they built on knowledge gained from the Paris gun. When American scientists developed the Redstone and Atlas rockets in the 1950s, they referenced V-2 research. When the first satellites reached orbit in 1957, they followed trajectories first explored by artillery shells fired at Paris in 1918. The chain of technological development runs unbroken from the forest of Coucy to Cape Canaveral. But that legacy is unintentional. The Paris gun was designed to terrorize a city, not to advance human knowledge. Its contribution to aerospace engineering was accidental, a side effect of solving ballistic problems at extreme ranges. The weapon itself remains what it was in 1918, an expensive, ineffective terror weapon that killed civilians and accomplished nothing of strategic value. 256 people died. The names are recorded. The graves exist. The families mourned. For them, the Paris gun was not a technological marvel or a historical curiosity. It was the weapon that killed their loved ones. That human cost cannot be forgotten or minimized, regardless of the weapon's failure to achieve its objectives. The German gun crews, too, were human. 80 men operating each gun, working with precision and dedication, doing their duty as they understood it. Some were wounded by French counter-battery fire. Some died in accidents. They were sailors following orders, not war criminals. The strategic failure was not their fault. And Paris endured. The city that had witnessed Julius Caesar, survived the Black Death, weathered the Revolution, and emerged from the siege of 1870, survived one more assault. The shells fell. The craters filled. The rubble was cleared. Life continued.
On August 9, 1918, when the last Paris gun shell fell, the weapon's story should have ended. But history remembers. The concrete emplacements remain. The church stands rebuilt. The documents survive in archives. And we tell the story again, wondering at the ambition, the brilliance, the futility of it all. The Paris gun fired into the stratosphere. It reached for the edge of space. It killed civilians and changed nothing. It was a weapon that should not have been built, operated with precision, and destroyed in defeat. Its legacy is not military victory, but a reminder that technological capability does not equal strategic wisdom. And in the end, that may be the most important lesson of all.